Over Germany in early 1945, contrails stretched across a colorless sky and radar screens glowed with confusion. Operators reported propeller aircraft chasing jet blips uphill. Pilots laughed. Impossible. The American Thunderbolt was too heavy, too slow, a brute of aluminum and noise. Nothing that large could climb with a jet. Yet the dots on the radar kept rising. Above the Rhine, Me-262S flared and stalled, their engines fading in thin air, while the silver P-47AS held steady and climbed past them. One German transmission cut off mid-sentence. For a moment, the sky fell silent, except for a deep rhythmic roar that did not belong to the jet age. For years, Luftwaffe crews had mocked the Thunderbolt's size, calling it the flying milk can. To them, it was an industrial mistake, American excess built with rivets instead of finesse. But inside its steel belly spun a turbine that made thin air thick again. It was not beauty that climbed that day, it was pressure and mathematics. The giant had outclimbed the jet. What the Reich thought was obsolete had become the machine that redefined altitude itself, a victory forged not in speed, but in endurance. By 1943, Europe's sky had hardened into layers of war. Beneath the clouds, bomber streams crawled eastward, gray lines of fortresses and liberators, while high above, fighters clawed for air so thin it could barely hold lift. Each month, the struggle moved higher. The side that could climb longer and stay stable at altitude would decide the war's shape. No. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first appeared, few believed it belonged in that fight. Fully loaded, it weighed more than 8 tons, heavier than many bombers it escorted. Its massive fuselage and thick wings made it look like a misplaced experiment. German pilots laughed. Allied crews called it the Jug, half joke, half insult. Even within American ranks, some doubted it. The Mustang was sleek, the Spitfire elegant, but the Thunderbolt was immense, loud, and slow to turn. Inside that bulk, however, hid a secret invisible to the eye. The Thunderbolt had been designed around an idea, not a form. Sustained power in air, too thin for engines to breathe. Alexander Kartveli and his team at Republic built the aircraft around the Pratt and Whitney R2, 1800 double Wasp, and a new General Electric turbo-supercharger. The exhaust from the engine powered a turbine in the tail that compressed air and fed it back through long ducts beneath the fuselage. The system added weight but changed physics. At 30,000 feet, where others starved, the Thunderbolt breathed as if still at sea level. In 1943, that advantage went unnoticed. Most missions stayed below 20,000 feet, where speed and agility decided survival. To pilots in dogfights, the P-47 seemed clumsy, its turning circle too wide, its takeoff roll endless. But as the bombing campaigns deepened over Germany, altitude became currency. Bombers needed cover above 30,000 feet, and only one fighter held its full power there. German intelligence misread the design entirely. To them, the Thunderbolt symbolized American over-engineering, a flying factory built by committee. They did not see the logic hidden within its weight, the thick skin to manage heat, the ducts to keep pressure steady, the turbine that turned excess into endurance. Every pound served a purpose. Then came the Me-262, the first jet fighter. It seemed to close the age of pistons overnight. The Luftwaffe believed that with speed alone, it could reclaim the sky. In straight flight, the jet could outrun everything. But it carried its own limits: delicate engines, low fuel endurance, and a steep penalty in long climbs. The higher it went, the less thrust it held. In contrast, the Thunderbolt's climb curve remained steady, powered by mechanical precision rather than bursts of speed. What looked like an anachronism became the exact answer to the jet's weakness. While German aircraft fought the atmosphere, the P-47 used it. By the time Allied radar began reporting jet contacts in late 1944, the Thunderbolt was no longer a misunderstood brute. It was the quiet machine that could stay where no other piston fighter could. What once seemed wasteful, the ducts, the mass, the constant turbine noise, had become its survival code. When the first jets appeared over the Ruhr, most pilots never saw them twice. They came fast, struck, and vanished. But in the upper haze, contrails of P-47As kept climbing through the silence, engines steady, turbos screaming under control. The war for speed had ended. The war for altitude had begun, and the Giant had been built for exactly that moment. At the core of the Thunderbolt was a contradiction, an aircraft too large to be graceful, yet too well engineered to fail. Its heart, the Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp, was an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of delivering over 2,000 horsepower. But power alone did not make altitude. The secret lay in the machinery behind it, the great General Electric turbo-supercharger that filled the fuselage like a second engine. Hot exhaust from the cylinders drove a turbine in the tail, spinning at speeds near 20,000 revolutions per minute. The turbine compressed fresh air and forced it forward through cooling ducts under the belly, keeping pressure steady as the Thunderbolt climbed. At sea level, this seemed unnecessary. At 30,000 feet, it was survival. The system let the R2800 breathe dense air long after other engines began to choke. This architecture made the aircraft enormous. The ducts and intercooler plumbing added weight measured in hundreds of kilograms. To the eye, the result looked inefficient. Too much metal, not enough aerodynamics. To engineers, it was logic. The Thunderbolt was not shaped by beauty. It was shaped by airflow and temperature control. The body was a shell for pressure. That weight became misunderstood as weakness. The P-47's takeoff roll was long, its turns wide, and its acceleration lazy at low altitude. But as it climbed, the rhythm changed. The higher it went, the steadier it grew. The turbo maintained constant power as other fighters lost their breath. In dives, mass became advantage. The aircraft could drop fast, hold its speed, then climb again without losing momentum. What looked like inertia was, in truth, stored energy. Pilots learned to trust this invisible force. They called it the push, that strange moment when above 20,000 feet, throttle response sharpened instead of fading. The turbo's shrill whistle filled the cockpit, and the propeller bit into air, thickened by pressure that did not belong there. Below, the world blurred into bands of gray. Above, the gauges steadied where others trembled. Early production models, the P-47 C and D, already displayed this endurance. Test climbs in 1943 recorded steady rates of 2,700 feet per minute at 20,000 feet. Numbers unremarkable at takeoff, but extraordinary in thin air. The difference was not how fast it climbed, but how long it could keep climbing. Its power curve did not spike and collapse. It held flat across the atmosphere. The cockpit was a furnace of vibration. Exhaust roared through the ducts, and the turbine's metallic scream never stopped. The pilot sat between heat and pressure, surrounded by armor that doubled as airflow structure. Behind him, the turbo whirled like an organ keeping him alive. When he eased the throttle forward, the machine surged without hesitation, an instant answer impossible for jets still learning to spool up. By 1944, engineers refined the airframe to match the system's endurance. The P-47M appeared with a tuned R2857 engine, higher boost settings, and a 4-blade propeller optimized for climb. It could reach 473 miles per hour and sustain more than 3,700 feet per minute at 20,000 feet. The follow-on P-47N stretched its wings and range for the Pacific, trading bulk for distance without losing altitude control. Together, these variants represented the peak of piston design, a machine that could still climb at full power when most others gasped. The secret of its success was stability. The turbo-supercharger delivered predictable thrust, regardless of weather or height. Jets were faster but fragile. Their acceleration vanished in the vertical. The Thunderbolt's pilots exploited that gap. They learned to fight in time rather than distance, forcing enemies into climbs they could not sustain. A typical intercept unfolded like a clock. The jets struck bombers and fled. The P-47MS, already high, turned toward the attack path and began long spirals upward. The turbo held pressure constant, letting them climb without fading. The Me-262S, forced to regain altitude, burned fuel and heat in exchange for seconds. The difference was not velocity, it was endurance. From the ground, observers saw contrails loop upward in clean geometry. Short trails marked jets struggling in climb. Long ropes marked Thunderbolts rising under control. The air battle had become a contest of lungs. Mechanics called the turbo unit the heart. They cleaned its blades with care, checking balance by touch. Replacement parts arrived from General Electric plants that operated day and night. The factories of America were not just building airplanes, they were manufacturing atmosphere. Each turbine installed was a portable sky. Within the 56th Fighter Group, pilots learned to read their engines like instruments of measurement. Oil pressure, intercooler temperature, manifold boost, these were not technicalities. They were survival math. They learned to keep the turbo in its power band, neither overheated nor lazy. A well-handled P-47 could hold climb longer than any enemy aircraft, piston, or jet. Its radial engine added resilience to its endurance. The air-cooled cylinders could take punishment that would ruin liquid-cooled fighters. Many Thunderbolts returned with holes in their cowlings, still running on half their cylinders. The turbo continued to feed air regardless. Even crippled, it could climb away. By late 1944, Luftwaffe pilots began reporting confusion. "They do not stop climbing," one wrote after an encounter. "We cannot follow them into the high haze." The insult of bulk had turned into the fear of persistence. The Thunderbolt's reputation shifted quietly. It was no longer mocked as a flying tank, but recognized as a design built on foresight. It embodied the principle that altitude is power multiplied by patience. The aircraft that once looked like excess had become the only piston fighter engineered for the sky above the jets. When mechanics closed the cowlings before dawn, the turbines already whined at idle. The giant waited not for speed, but for time itself to run thin. Above 30,000 feet, where air forgot to breathe, the P-47 did not slow. It continued climbing, unshaken, carrying the weight that others could no longer lift. The jet entered the war wrapped in myth. To German pilots, the Me-262 promised effortless dominance, speed beyond pursuit, altitude beyond reach. In level flight, it was unmatched. But the climb is not the same as the dash. A climb is endurance against gravity, a negotiation between thrust and time. It is where raw power fades into physics. And in that narrow corridor, the Thunderbolt waited. Its pilots had studied the jet's rhythm. They knew its engines burned too hot to sustain pressure, its throttle too slow to answer quickly. The 262 could strike and vanish, but it could not linger uphill. Every second spent climbing drained its fuel, its heat margin, and its advantage. The P-47, by contrast, did not climb fast. It climbed forever. In winter 1945, bomber streams crossed the Rhine at 30,000 feet. Below them, contrails of fighters curled through the haze like white scaffolding. Ground controllers near Kassel reported strange patterns, jets diving from the sun, then stalling in climb while propeller aircraft arced smoothly upward behind. It made no sense until the altitude data was checked. The heavy Americans were gaining height after every interception. German crews laughed less. The Me-262's acceleration, once terrifying, now betrayed its weakness. Its twin Jumo 004 engines lost thrust rapidly in thin air. Throttle lag forced pilots to nurse the climb instead of drive it. The Thunderbolt met them not in speed, but in patience. When the jets flattened out, the P-47s were already above, waiting. The tactic was simple geometry. The Thunderbolt could not chase in a straight line, but it could control vertical space. Let the jet dive, expend energy, and then begin the long spiral climb. Keep the turbo at redline, maintain manifold pressure, and let the curve of physics invert itself. The heavier fighter became lighter by duration. One recorded encounter north of the Ruhr told the pattern precisely. Two Me-262s streaked through a bomber formation and pulled up hard to regain altitude. The 56th Fighter Group climbed in four-ship formation from 26,000 feet, engines at full boost. The Germans rose faster at first, then slowed. The jet's bright exhaust dimmed from white to orange as fuel flow dropped. The P-47 continued their arc, heavy but steady, turbines screaming like wind through iron. At 33,000 feet, the trails merged. One jet rolled out, the other stalled, its pilot forced to dive away into thicker air. From the bombers, it looked inverted, prop fighters climbing past jets, Radio transcripts captured disbelief. "They're still going up. How?" No one answered. Above, the contrails thickened into a helix of persistence. This was not luck but calculation. The Thunderbolt's turbo gave it constant manifold pressure far beyond normal piston limits. Its climb did not depend on burst power, but on sustained pressure across minutes. The Me-262's advantage lived only in the first 30 seconds. Beyond that, drag and heat reclaimed the promise of the jet age. Allied controllers adjusted doctrine accordingly. Top cover became a vertical stack, Thunderbolts at the summit, Mustangs below, bombers beneath. When radar tracked jet contacts, upper groups tightened formation and began timed climbs before the intercept. The idea was not pursuit, but containment. If the jets wanted to reach the bombers again, they would have to climb through the altitude band the P-47S already held. The air above Germany became layered defense. Inside the cockpit, a Thunderbolt pilot prepared for that climb like ritual. Mixture full rich, propeller fine, turbo gate open, boost gauge rising. The turbine whine increased until it blurred into vibration. Once the aircraft reached its rhythm, the world outside flattened into haze. Every minute the gauges stayed steady was a minute stolen from the jets below. From the ground, the sound was distinct. Jets howled, then faded. The Thunderbolt's radial growl continued long after. It was a different kind of music, mechanical patience over mechanical pride. The Luftwaffe had built for bursts. The Americans had built for continuity. Every engagement ended the same way, not with a spectacular kill, but with absence. The jets retreated low on fuel, the bombers held course, the Thunderbolts resumed orbit. The battle was invisible on the map, yet decisive in outcome. Each climb denied the enemy another attempt. Statistics later confirmed what pilots already sensed. In sustained combat climbs above 25,000 feet, the P-47M averaged 3,600 feet per minute for 5 minutes without temperature failure. The Me-262 began higher but dropped below 2,000 feet per minute by the 4th minute. In endurance, the numbers had traded places. Training followed data. New pilots learned not to chase level targets. "Let them come up tired," their instructors said. The phrase became unofficial doctrine across the 8th Air Force. Climbing was no longer reaction. It was strategy. Each mission refined the rhythm. Dive for energy, zoom to altitude, hold turbo boost, repeat. In that loop, the Thunderbolt became something larger than a fighter. It was a regulator of sky pressure. The Luftwaffe had entered the war believing speed would replace endurance. By 1945, altitude had replaced speed. When German intelligence briefed field units on Allied fighters that winter, their memos admitted a shift. The P-47 demonstrates exceptional high-altitude persistence. Jet aircraft should avoid extended climbs in combat zone. It was as close to concession as any document could state. At sunset, returning pilots saw their contrails glowing red in the high air, a visible record of time spent beyond the jet's reach. Below, airfields burned. Above, the sky belonged to the machines built not for beauty, but for balance. The climb had become the message. Weight was no longer limitation. It was authority. The Thunderbolt's endurance rewrote the physics of combat. The jet's promise of effortless dominance had collided with a truth carved in metal. Victory at altitude belonged not to those who rose fastest, but to those who never stopped rising. By early 1945, the air above Germany was mapped by altitude rather than distance. Radar operators could almost predict where each class of aircraft would appear. Bombers between 20 and 25,000 feet, Mustangs a little higher, and above them all, Thunderbolts circling like patient machinery. The Me-262S came from below that grid, brief, violent, and temporary. The war in the sky had become an engineering equation written in layers of air. Allied intelligence now tracked jet patterns the way artillery tracked shellfire. Every Me-262 sortie followed the same rhythm: climb, attack, dive, climb again. It was in that return climb, the second ascent, that the Luftwaffe lost the war of altitude. Each ascent drained more energy than it returned, and the Thunderbolt, heavy but unrelenting, was always waiting in that interval of weakness. On March 3, 1945, over the Eder Valley, the rhythm broke open. Two Mi-262s slashed through a bomber stream and turned west to regain altitude. The nearest P-47M flight began climbing from 26,000 feet, their turbines screaming as boost gauges climbed. The German leader eased his throttles to save the engines. His wingman tried to keep pace and began overheating. In 3 minutes, the Americans reached 30,000 feet. In 4, they were closing. The first burst of .50 caliber fire tore across the jet's wing route. The second sent it spiraling downward, trailing fragments of aluminum. The other fled at full thrust, leaving a thin vapor trail that ended in the horizon haze. That engagement was not remarkable by numbers, but by pattern. The P-47 did not catch the jet by speed. It caught it by outlasting its acceleration. The same logic repeated across Europe. Jets began fights they could not finish, while Thunderbolts ended fights without starting them. Captured Luftwaffe reports later revealed the frustration. "The Americans are always there, higher and waiting," one pilot wrote. Another noted bitterly, "They attack downhill. We cannot follow." To German crews, the Thunderbolts seemed to multiply with altitude. Every climb risked contact. Every escape led back to the same ceiling of pressure. By March, the 56th Fighter Group refined the tactic into a routine. They flew in altitude tiers, each element separated by 2,000 feet. When radar stations detected jets lifting off, top cover throttled forward, already climbing toward predicted intercept points. They no longer hunted, they constrained. Their objective was to occupy altitude before the jets arrived. The strategy worked because of physics as much as planning. The Mi-262's twin Jumo 004 engines delivered immense thrust only within a narrow speed range. In extended climbs, airflow thinned, fuel flow rose, and temperature control failed. The P-47's turbo-supercharged radial, in contrast, operated like a breathing machine, constant pressure, constant combustion, unbothered by density loss. The result was not spectacle, but inevitability. Observers from the bomber formations described it with disbelief. "The jets came in fast and left slower," one wrote. "By the time they turned back, the Thunderbolts were above them again." For the first time since 1940, the Luftwaffe had lost its vertical advantage. In the spring of 1945, altitude over Germany resembled an industrial conveyor belt. Below 20,000 feet, ground fire dominated. Between 20 and 30, bombers and Mustangs held formation. Above 30, Thunderbolts patrolled alone. Each machine was a gear in an organized sky. Against this structure, the Mi-262's independence was weakness. It could fight but not sustain. At Boxted, the 56th Group's mechanics called their workspace the pressure floor. Every turbine blade was checked for balance and cooling stress. The men knew the climb depended on precision, not luck. A single warped fin could break the cycle of altitude control. The aircraft's performance had become an industrial partnership, factory, field, and pilot operating as one continuous machine. The final months of combat turned that coordination into repetition. Intercepts blurred together, jets rising and falling, contrails crossing like white scars above the Ruhr. Few direct kills were claimed, but that no longer mattered. The mission metric had changed. As long as the bombers reached their targets untouched by the second wave, victory was recorded. In late March, radar detected multiple jet contacts over Magdeburg. 4 Thunderbolts from the 78th Group climbed to meet them. The encounter lasted less than 10 minutes. When the jets broke away, 3 were confirmed down, 1 missing. All 4 P-47s returned, engines running clean, fuel still in reserve. On paper, it was an engagement. In truth, it was a demonstration, altitude as endurance. Ground command measured success in curves, not explosions. Plotted on graphs, each combat climb of a P-47 formed a slow, steady ascent that barely bent downward. The Mi-262's trace, steep at first, flattened abruptly, and then dropped. The 2 curves told the story of the war's last air duels more clearly than any report. By April, the jet's promise had become its burden. Fuel shortages, maintenance failures, and destroyed airfields confined operations to scattered sorties. Each Mi-262 that launched did so under the shadow of altitude control it could not regain. The Luftwaffe's finest technology had met the one opponent it could not outclimb: time itself, measured in horsepower and minutes. The Thunderbolt, built in thousands, could afford patience. It no longer needed to win single combats. It needed only to remain present. The Luftwaffe, reduced to prototypes and fragments, faced an enemy that did not tire, did not burn out, and could be replaced faster than it could be fought. When Germany surrendered in May, captured airfields revealed dozens of Me-262s left intact, engines split open, turbines scorched. Mechanics studying them noted the irony: a jet built to escape friction had been undone by it. Meanwhile, Thunderbolts returned from missions and were simply parked, engines idling at normal temperature, turbines still humming in rhythm. The sky over Europe was quiet again, its layers unbroken. The contrails that had once twisted in combat now dissolved slowly into the blue. What had begun as an age of speed had ended as a lesson in endurance. The jet age would continue, but its first test had already delivered its verdict. The future belonged not to the fastest, but to the most stable. In the silence after victory, the Thunderbolt stood as proof of that equation. Its climb was not a moment. It was a process. Each ascent had been an act of patience multiplied by pressure, repeated until the air itself conceded. What began as mockery ended as mastery, carved across the upper sky where no jet could remain. By the final months of 1945, the sound of the war had changed. The roar of engines no longer marked chaos, but continuity, a rhythm of controlled pressure, thousands of turbines feeding an empire of air. The Thunderbolt was no longer one aircraft among many. It had become a moving factory of endurance, the industrial reflection of the nation that built it. More than 15,000 P-47s had rolled from American lines, each assembled by the same methodical choreography. In the turbo plants of General Electric, molten alloy flowed into turbine molds that glowed like small suns. Technicians measured blade curvature in microns. Where the Me-262 demanded scarcity and secrecy, the Thunderbolt demanded precision by the ton. It was the mechanical handwriting of a country that could turn physics into production. In Europe, airfields expanded faster than cities. Thunderbolts landed on steel mats spread over mud, refueled in minutes, and climbed again. The turbo's durability made it immune to dust, frost, and neglect. Where other engines coughed at dawn, the R2800 woke instantly, its exhaust shimmering in the cold. The fighter had matured from prototype to infrastructure, a machine as predictable as sunrise. The Luftwaffe by then had dissolved into fragments. Jet bases hid in forests, their runways cratered, their refueling trucks destroyed by the same aircraft they once hunted. Each Me-262 sortie required fuel convoys that rarely arrived. German pilots still spoke of speed, but they fought against distance and time. The Thunderbolt, slow to admire, fast to multiply, erased that time. Inside the Allied command maps, altitude was no longer contested space but organized property. The upper layers belonged to Thunderbolts, the middle to Mustangs, the bottom to bombers and transports. The air war had turned into a form of logistics, the transfer of energy upward until no space remained for resistance. For pilots, the transformation felt both mechanical and human. The aircraft was no longer a weapon they commanded, but a system they joined. They spoke of trust, not affection. It was not beautiful, but it always came back. Many had seen flak holes in the wings, oil pouring from the cowl, yet the turbo still turned. The manifold pressure still held. The P-47 carried its pilots home from distances where hope should have failed. The same engine that ruled the stratosphere also ruled the roads. When the front advanced, Thunderbolts swooped low, their 8.50 caliber guns tearing through convoys and rail lines. In one day, a squadron could burn an entire transport network, then climb into the cold to escort bombers over the next target. The turbine never cared where it fought. Commanders realized that the fighter had outgrown its category. It was an all-purpose aerial platform: interceptor, escort, attacker, guardian. The 56th Fighter Group called it the hammer that works both ways. In ground attack, its size made it steady. In altitude, its turbo made it sovereign. It had become both spear and shield of the Allied air machine. Each factory in America fed this system like arteries feeding a single heart. Pratt and Whitney shipped engines. General Electric shipped turbines. Republic Aircraft sent airframes by rail. Assembly lines moved faster than attrition. The Luftwaffe lost a pilot and an aircraft. The United States replaced 3 in the time it took the report to reach headquarters. The result was an army of consistency, a fleet of identical power flying by identical checklists. When General William Kepner reviewed operational data in March 1945, the conclusion was already clear. The P-47 squadrons had logged more flight hours than any other Allied fighter in Europe. Their loss ratio had fallen even as mission distance doubled. The advantage was not agility, but reliability. No other aircraft could operate at such altitude for such duration across so many conditions. In a war that punished complexity, simplicity had won by design. Yet the Thunderbolt's strength was not simplicity. It was managed complexity. Its turbo system was the most advanced mechanical organism of the piston era. It turned waste heat into power, chaos into rhythm. Engineers saw in it the template for post-war turbines. The jet age would soon begin, but its core principles had already flown. As the Allies advanced, the Thunderbolt's reach expanded. From fields in Belgium to captured strips in Germany, its range shaped strategy. With new drop tanks, it could sweep past the Rhine, refuel once, and return without strain. Each flight extended Allied eyes and fire farther east, compressing the Reich's airspace until no escape remained. The final months became an exhibition of control. The Luftwaffe still had jets, but they flew like sparks, brilliant, brief, extinguished. The P-47 climbed, turned, and hovered in dominance, their power measured in hours rather than seconds. The sky no longer needed heroes, it needed endurance. When victory came, it was quiet. Jet wrecks lay beside railways, their engines blackened from heat. Thunderbolts landed on those same fields, engines idling smoothly. Mechanics stepped out, checked oil, wiped down turbine casings, and started again. The war had ended the way it had been won, by repetition, not drama. After the surrender, engineers toured captured bases. They found me 262 engines dismantled and warped, their turbine blades cracked after barely 20 hours of flight. In contrast, many P-47 units still operated with their original turbochargers, some logging more than 200 missions without failure. The contrast was not just mechanical, it was philosophical. Germany had built speed, America had built endurance. The factories that once turned out P-47 components now turned to peace. Their lathes cut jet compressor blades, their engineers drafted early designs for axial turbines. The transition was smooth because the groundwork already existed. The Thunderbolt had been a bridge between eras, the piston fighter that spoke the language of jets before jets could survive their own heat. For the men who flew it, memory came in sound. Even decades later, veterans recalled the deep radial rumble rising into a high metallic whine as the turbo reached full spin. That sound, more than the aircraft shape, defined it. It was not speed they remembered, but the endless climb, steady, heavy, absolute. At museums decades later, visitors still misjudged its scale. They stood beneath the silver wings, surprised by its mass. That weight was not inefficiency, it was permanence. Each bolt, panel, and duct represented a choice for endurance over appearance. The Thunderbolt did not chase beauty, it chased control. Its legacy outlived its missions. Engineers studying post-war flight data saw that its climb performance and mechanical reliability had achieved what the Me-262 never could. Operational altitude dominance, sustained across thousands of sorties. The result was a new rule for aerial warfare. The winning machine is not the lightest, or even the fastest, but the one that keeps its power when the air disappears. In that truth lay the essence of Allied victory. America's industrial scale had turned physics into policy. The Thunderbolt was the proof, an aircraft that transformed ridicule into strategy, weight into altitude, and noise into control. When the last P-47 shut down their engines in 1945, the turbines cooled slowly, hissing into silence. Mechanics stood beside them, listening to the final clicks of metal contracting. They knew the sound meant more than rest. It meant completion. The war that began with biplanes and dreams of speed had ended with a machine that proved endurance itself could be a weapon. The Thunderbolt had not merely outlasted the jets, it had outlasted the war. In the end, it left behind no mystery, only a fact. Altitude, once an aspiration, had become American property, built not by chance but by pressure, repetition, and the mathematics of persistence. When silence returned to Europe's sky, the Thunderbolt remained, massive, cold, and undefeated by air or time. The war had moved on, but the machine built for altitude still stood on captured airfields, its turbines cooling in the wind. To those who had fought, it looked like a relic of excess. To engineers, it was the blueprint of what came next. Alexander Kartveli had never designed the P-47 for beauty. He designed it for pressure. Every curve of metal existed to contain force, every duct to preserve breath. When technicians from other nations examined its turbo system after the war, they realized it was more than a piston fighter. It was an experiment in atmospheric control. The airflow circuits, intercoolers, and turbines inside its fuselage anticipated jet engineering. It was a bridge between combustion and the future. For the pilots, memory was sound more than sight. They remembered the cockpit vibration, the steady climb through air so thin it shimmered. At altitude, where the world dissolved into blue haze, the gauges stayed firm while enemy trails bent and fell away. Many had flown Mustangs and Spitfires, but none forgot the feel of the P-47's climb, a sense not of speed but of endurance without limit. Post-war studies at Wright Field confirmed what those veterans already knew. The Thunderbolt's operational performance matched or exceeded early jet fighters in range and reliability. Its sustained climb at high altitude equaled the Me-262's initial burst, but lasted 3 times longer. In a world newly obsessed with velocity, the old piston machine had defined a different kind of power: consistency. The factories that built its turbines transitioned smoothly to peace. General Electric engineers who had shaped its compressor blades now designed jet impellers. The R2800's turbo became the ancestor of the turbojet, its logic preserved in metal. The line from the Thunderbolt's tail turbine to the first F-86 Sabres was direct. America had not just won the war, it had industrialized the air itself. At museums decades later, visitors still misjudged its scale. Standing beside its wings, they saw why the Germans laughed in 1943. It seemed impossibly large for a single pilot, yet every inch of that mass existed for reason: heat dissipation, airflow stability, structural margin. Its size was its armor against altitude, its proof that design could outthink fragility. Time reduced every other weapon of the war to nostalgia. But the Thunderbolt resisted sentiment. It was not romantic. It was rational. It stood for the shift from bravery to process, from daring to design. It had turned industrial output into aerodynamic certainty. Each climb was a data point. Each victory, a solved equation. When historians later searched for the true end of the piston era, they did not find it in 1945's surrender parades. They found it here, in the turbine whine of a machine that had already learned the rules of the jet age before the jets themselves survived them. The P-47 was not replaced by progress. It was absorbed by it. Its legacy spread far beyond its wingspan. The doctrine it proved, that altitude supremacy depends on sustained energy, not instant speed, became the foundation of post-war air power. Every jet that followed carried the same principle in quieter form: control of climb equals control of sky. The Thunderbolt had written that rule in contrails and combustion. In the calm after victory, those who had once mocked its mass understood the irony. The flying milk can had ended the age of improvisation. It had turned flight into engineering discipline. And when its final engines shut down, the silence that followed did not sound like the end of an era, but the beginning of one that it had already designed. The sky had belonged to many machines, but the last one to master it with propeller and piston was this: the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the giant that climbed past its own century and showed the world that endurance, not elegance, is what truly reaches the top. High above the ruins of Europe, where the air once shimmered with fire and contrails, the Thunderbolt wrote its last line: It had entered the war mocked as a monster and ended it as proof that endurance can outfly speed. No design so heavy had ever climbed so high or stayed there so long. From the ground, its contrails looked like drawn steel, steady, unbroken, outlasting the smoke below. Pilots remembered not the kills, but the silence after the climb, when nothing moved except the slow turn of gauges and the hum of the turbine behind them. That sound, half roar and half heartbeat, was the voice of a new kind of warfare, one ruled by power managed, not power spent. Weight had become reach, heat had become control. The giant that should have fallen had instead turned gravity into its instrument. When peace came, the sky it left behind was empty of enemies, filled only with memory. The P-47 had not conquered the air by grace or speed. It had done so by endurance, precision, and the refusal to descend first. Above the Reich, the last climb of the Thunderbolt was not speed, it was permanence.